Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the back of the Great Hall on Aethera and tried not to clench her fists. The ceiling rose so high above her that clouds actually formed near the top. Thousands of alien delegates filled the curved seats, their voices buzzing and clicking and humming in 100 different languages. The translation device in her ear turned it all into words she could understand, and most of those words were not kind to her species. "The humans wish to speak again," said the Kethvari delegate, a tall insect-like creature with 4 arms and eyes like black glass. His voice carried amusement the way a parent might sound when a child asks to stay up late. How charming. Lena did not react. She had learned long ago that reacting was what they wanted. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord 40 years ago, and in all that time, nothing had changed. 4,000 species sat in this hall. Most of them were older than human civilization itself. The Draelith, who looked like walking trees with silver leaves, had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to farm wheat. The Salmari, beings made of living crystal that glowed with soft light, had built their first cities before Earth even had oceans. And then there were humans. Young, loud, emotional, violent, they said, always fighting each other over patches of dirt and imaginary lines on maps. The Concord had given humanity a small territory on the Orion Spur, a quiet corner of the galaxy that nobody else wanted, and they called it the Cradle, as if humans were babies who needed watching. Lena had a speech prepared about trade routes. She never got to give it. The first warning came as a light on the main display screen. It blinked red 3 times, and the entire hall went silent. Lena had never heard 4,000 species go quiet at the same time before. It was the most frightening sound she had ever experienced, which was strange because it was no sound at all. The Kethvari delegate was the first to move. He pressed a panel on his chair, and his face changed. His 4 arms went stiff. His black eyes widened until Lena could see her own reflection in them. "The Border Fleet," he said. His voice was no longer amused. "The 9th Border Fleet is gone." The hall erupted. Every delegate began talking at once. The display screen filled with data, and Lena read it as fast as her translator could work. A Kethvari fleet of 300 warships had been stationed at the edge of known space, near a region called the Hollow Rim. 11 minutes ago, they had sent a distress signal. The signal lasted 9 seconds. Then, there was nothing. 300 warships destroyed in 11 minutes. The Concord scrambled to find answers. Long-range sensors were aimed at the Hollow Rim, and what they found made the hall go quiet for a second time. There was a tear in space itself, a wound in the fabric of the universe that stretched for thousands of kilometers, and things were coming through it. Ships, if they could even be called ships. They were alive, organic, grown rather than built. They moved like creatures of the deep ocean, pulsing and writhing, as they crossed from whatever dark place they called home into the galaxy. There were thousands of them already, and more were coming every second. The Concord scientists identified them within the hour. The Vral Dominion. The name existed in the oldest records of the oldest species, in stories so ancient they were treated as myths. An extragalactic swarm intelligence that moved from galaxy to galaxy, consuming everything in its path. They had no diplomats, they had no language. They had only hunger. Panic spread through the hall like fire through dry grass. The Draelith delegate called for calm in a voice that shook like wind through dead branches. The Solmari delegate dimmed with fear, her crystal body losing its glow. The Kethvari demanded immediate military action, but when the Concord pulled up the combined fleet records, the truth was devastating. Most species had not fought a real war in thousands of years. Their warships were beautiful and ceremonial. Their weapons were designed for show. Their admirals had studied theory, but had never fired a shot in anger. The galaxy had been at peace for so long that it had forgotten what war actually looked like. The debates went on for hours. Some delegates wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to run. A few wanted to surrender and hope the Vral would leave them alive. Nobody could agree on anything. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Ancient alliances cracked under the weight of real, genuine terror. Lena watched all of it in silence. She thought about Earth. She thought about the long, bloody history of her species. The wars that had burned across continents, the trenches filled with mud and death, the mushroom clouds that had scarred the sky, the famines, the plagues, the genocides that humanity had survived not because it was special, but because it refused to stop getting back up. She thought about what the galaxy called humanity's greatest weakness, its love of conflict, its inability to stop fighting, its obsessive need to build weapons, even when there was no enemy in sight. And she thought about the message she was about to send. Lena stepped out of the Great Hall, into a corridor that overlooked the glowing cityscape of Aethara. She pulled out a communication device, a small human-made thing that looked crude next to the elegant alien technology around her. And she typed 6 words on an encrypted channel that went straight to Earth. "It's happening. Wake them up." She stood there for a long time after she sent it, watching the alien city below. Beautiful towers of light and crystal stretched toward a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Millions of beings lived down there, going about their lives, not yet knowing that something was coming to eat them all. Lena put the device away and straightened her jacket. She was not a soldier. She was not a general. She was a diplomat who had spent years smiling politely while aliens called her species primitive. But she knew something that none of them knew. She knew what was waiting back home. She knew what humanity had been building in the dark, quiet places where no one ever looked. She knew that every insult, every dismissal, every time an alien had called humans violent and barbaric, her people had smiled and nodded and gone back to work. The galaxy had asked for help, and now it was going to find out why humanity had never stopped preparing for the worst. Lena walked back into the Great Hall, with her hands steady and her face calm. Around her 4,000 species argued and panicked and wept. She sat down in her small seat at the back of the room, the seat they had given to the children of the galaxy, and she waited. Help was coming. They just did not know it yet. The message reached Earth in 4 seconds. It traveled through a network of relay stations that the Galactic Concord did not know about, along channels that no alien sensor had ever detected, and it arrived on a screen inside a room that did not officially exist. Fleet Admiral Alexander Morozov read the 6 words twice. Then he set down his coffee, picked up a red phone that connected to 17 different locations across human space, and said one sentence: "Begin the Forge Protocol." Deep beneath the surface of Mars, lights came on in tunnels that had been dark for decades. On Titan, Saturn's largest moon, massive doors ground open in the ice, revealing caverns so large that entire cities could have fit inside them. In the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, hollowed-out rocks, the size of mountains, began to hum with power, as reactors that had been sleeping in cold storage woke up for the first time. The galaxy thought it knew what humanity was. A young species with a small fleet of modest ships, enough to patrol their little corner of space and nothing more. The Concord's records listed the United Terran Navy as having approximately 200 vessels, most of them light cruisers and patrol boats. It was the kind of fleet that made elder species smile with pity. Those records were wrong. They were wrong because humanity had wanted them to be wrong. For 40 years, every human leader who had ever sat in a position of power had made the same quiet decision: smile at the aliens, accept their insults, Let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. And never ever let them see what was being built behind the curtain. The true size of the United Terran Navy was not 200 ships. It was over 1,200. And they were not patrol boats. Captain Rhea Okafor received the activation order while she was eating dinner in her apartment on the orbital station above Earth. She read the message, put down her fork, and sat very still for exactly 10 seconds. Then she stood up, put on her uniform, and walked to the transit hub without looking back. 3 hours later, she stood on the bridge of the heavy dreadnought, Unconquered Sun. And she felt the ship wake up around her, like a giant animal stretching after a long sleep. The Unconquered Sun was 2 kilometers long from bow to stern. Its hull was made of layered armor so thick that it could survive a direct nuclear strike and keep fighting. It carried kinetic accelerators that could punch holes through moons, nuclear lance batteries that could melt a city from orbit, and experimental gravity shear weapons that could tear the fabric of space itself. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It looked like a slab of angry metal designed by people who expected to be hit very hard and wanted to hit back harder. That was exactly what it was. "All stations report ready," said her first officer, Commander Torres, a stocky man with scars on his hands from a training accident years ago. "Crew is at 92%. The rest are in transit." "Good enough," Okafor said. "Take us out." Across human space, the same scene repeated itself 1,000 times over. Dreadnoughts, carriers, destroyers, siege breakers, support ships, and troop transports powered up and pulled away from hidden docks. Crews who had trained for years without ever telling their alien neighbors what they were training for finally put on their armor and took their stations. Fighter pilots climbed into cockpits. Marines loaded their weapons. Engineers ran final checks on systems that had been maintained with religious care, even during the long years of peace. The Forge Protocol was not just a military activation. It was the result of a philosophy that had been burned into human thinking by 10,000 years of painful history. Peace was wonderful. Peace was the goal. But peace without the ability to defend it was just a different word for waiting to be a victim. Humanity had learned that lesson in blood, over and over again, and it had never forgotten. Back on Ithara, the Galactic Concord was still arguing. 3 more star systems had fallen to the Vral in the 2 days since the first attack. Billions of beings were dead or fleeing. The swarm was growing, feeding on the planets it consumed, turning the matter of conquered worlds into more ships, more soldiers, more hunger. The Concord voted to issue a plea of collective peril, the most desperate request in galactic law. It was a call to every member species to send whatever military forces they had to a staging area near the Kalindra Corridor, a narrow passage of open space between 2 nebulae where the Allied fleet would attempt to make a stand. The responses came in slowly. The Salmari offered a fleet of 400 elegant cruisers with powerful shields. The Draelis sent 200 bioships grown from living wood and powered by photosynthesis. The Kethvari pulled together what was left of their navy, about 1,000 ships, battered and shaken, but willing to fight. Other species sent what they could. Some sent nothing at all. And then the humans responded. Ambassador Vasquez stood before the Concord and spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried across the silent hall. The United Terran Navy is prepared to deploy 1,200 warships to the Kalindra staging area. All vessels are combat ready. All crews are trained for extended offensive operations. We will arrive within 72 hours. The silence that followed was unlike anything Lena had ever experienced. It was not the silence of respect or the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a room full of beings whose understanding of reality had just been broken in half. The Kethvari delegate spoke first. 1,200? Your records show 200 vessels at most. Our records show what we wanted them to show, Lena said. The Dralith ambassador, an ancient being whose silver leaves had turned dark with age, leaned forward from his seat. His voice was like wind through a forest. How long have you been preparing for this? Lena looked at him. She thought about every ancestor who had ever picked up a weapon to protect their family. She thought about every general who had planned for a war they hoped would never come. She thought about every factory worker, every engineer, every scientist who had spent their career building something terrible and necessary in the hope that it would never be used. Since before we met you, she said, we have always been preparing. The hall erupted into chaos. Some delegates shouted in anger, demanding to know how humans had hidden such a massive military buildup. Others expressed disbelief. A few, the wiser ones, simply sat in their seats and stared at the human ambassador with something new in their eyes. It was not yet respect, but it was the beginning of it. On the bridge of the unconquered sun, Captain Okafor watched the fleet assemble on her tactical display. 1,200 dots of light, each one representing a warship, crewed by men and women who had chosen to stand between their species and whatever darkness the universe could throw at them. Set course for Kalindra. All ahead full. Commander Torres looked at her. Any words for the crew, Captain? Okafor thought about it. She pressed the ship-wide communication button and spoke. This is the captain. Most of you have spent your entire careers training for a fight that everyone told us would never come. Well, it came. Somewhere out there, billions of beings are dying because no one was ready to protect them. We are ready. We have always been ready. So let us go do what humans do best. Let us go save everyone. The unconquered sun jumped to hyperspace, and the stars stretched into lines of white light. Behind it, 1,200 warships followed, moving together in perfect formation, a fist of iron and fire aimed at the throat of the darkness. The cradle was empty now. Its children had gone to war. The Kalindra staging point was a wide stretch of empty space between two great nebulae that glowed purple and gold like bruises in the dark. It was chosen because it was open, defensible, and close enough to the Vral advance that a fleet could strike from it before more systems fell. Allied ships had been gathering there for 2 days, arriving in small groups from every corner of the galaxy, and from a distance, the staging area looked like a field of fireflies. The Salmari cruisers were the most beautiful. They were sleek, silver things that caught the light of distant stars and turned it into rainbows along their hulls. Their shields were the strongest in the galaxy, layered energy fields that could absorb tremendous punishment. But their weapons were designed for precision, not destruction. They could cut with the accuracy of a surgeon's knife, but they lacked the raw power to tear through heavy armor. The Dralith bioships were strange and wonderful. They were grown from a species of spacefaring plant that the Dralith had cultivated for millennia. Each ship was alive, breathing, capable of healing its own wounds over time. They moved through space like great seeds carried on invisible winds. They were tough and enduring, but they were slow, and their offensive weapons were limited to sprays of corrosive spores that took time to eat through enemy hulls. The HFY warships were angular, efficient, and built for speed. They were the closest thing the galaxy had to a real military force, but the destruction of their border fleet had shaken their confidence badly. Their crews were disciplined but afraid. They had never lost a battle so completely, so quickly, and the memory of it hung over them like a shadow. Together, the Allied fleet numbered roughly 6,000 vessels. It was an impressive sight. War Marshal Thys of the HFY, who had been given command of the combined force, looked at the tactical display aboard his flagship and allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. 6,000 ships was a significant force. Perhaps with the right strategy, it would be enough. Then the humans arrived, and cautious hope turned into something else entirely. There was no warning. One moment the space behind the Allied fleet was empty. The next moment, it was full. 1,200 ships dropped out of hyperspace at exactly the same instant, in perfect formation, arranged in rows and columns so precise that the gaps between them could have been measured with a ruler. The timing was so exact, the coordination so flawless, that several alien sensor officers thought their equipment had malfunctioned. The Allied fleet had never seen anything like the ships that now hung in space behind them. The Terran warships were dark, not painted dark, but built from materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They were angular and brutal, all flat planes and sharp edges, as if someone had taken blocks of metal and carved them with an axe rather than shaping them with art. There was no decoration, no color, no beauty of any kind. Every surface served a purpose. Every line existed for a reason. And that reason was war. The dreadnoughts were the largest, each one stretching over 2 kilometers long. They were wider and heavier than anything in the Allied fleet, built like floating fortresses, with armor so thick it showed invisible layers along their hulls. The carriers sat behind them, massive rectangular vessels with open bays that held hundreds of fighter craft. The destroyers moved in tight packs around the bigger ships, lean and fast, and covered in weapons. And scattered among them were the siege breakers, strange spherical ships that carried the gravity-shear weapons capable of bending space itself. Several alien ships had scars on their hulls from accidents or minor encounters. The human ships had scars too, but theirs were different. They were kill markings, small symbols burned into the armor, each one representing a confirmed destruction of an enemy vessel. The aliens had never seen these markings before, because the humans had never told anyone about the border skirmishes they had fought in the dark corners of their territory, quiet little wars against pirates and raiders that the Concorde never knew about. Fleet Admiral Morozov's voice came through every communication channel in the staging area, calm and steady as stone. Terran Navy, present and accounted for, point us at the enemy. On the bridge of the Kethvari flagship, War Marshal Fiss stared at his display for a very long time. He had spent his career studying military theory. He had written books on fleet tactics. He had commanded the largest navy in the Concorde. And in that moment, looking at the Terran formation, he understood with perfect clarity that he had never truly understood war at all. These humans did. Captain Okafor stood on the bridge of the unconquered sun and watched the Allied fleet on her own display. She could see the alien ships changing formation slightly, unconsciously pulling away from the Terran fleet, the way small fish move away from a shark. She did not blame them. A soft chime announced a visitor. The bridge door opened, and a Solmari officer walked in. The being was young, slender, and made of pale blue crystal that pulsed gently with inner light. The translator identified them as Vale, a bridge officer assigned as a liaison between the Solmari fleet and the unconquered sun. Vale stopped 3 steps inside the door and looked around. The bridge of the unconquered sun was nothing like a Solmari ship. There were no curved surfaces, no soft lighting, no aesthetic touches of any kind. Everything was flat, gray, reinforced. The chairs were bolted to the floor with heavy brackets. The walls were lined with emergency equipment, medical kits, fire suppression systems, and racks of weapons in case of boarding. Thick blast doors stood ready to seal off every section. "This is your bridge?" Vale asked quietly. "This is our bridge," Okafor confirmed. Vale walked slowly to one of the reinforced walls and touched it. The crystal of their fingers rang softly against the cold metal. "Your people built this expecting to be hurt." Okafor looked at the young alien with eyes that had seen things she hoped Vale would never have to see. We built this expecting to win after being hurt. There is a difference. Vale considered this for a moment. It was a concept that did not exist in Solmari culture. The idea that being wounded was not the end, but simply a phase that came before victory. The Solmari built their ships to avoid damage entirely. When their shields failed, they retreated. The thought of continuing to fight while broken, while bleeding, while burning, was alien to them, in the truest sense of the word. Over the next 2 days, a war council was held aboard the Kethvari flagship. Fleet Admiral Morozov attended alongside War Marshal Thys, and commanders from every allied species. The discussion was tense. Thys wanted to spread the fleet in a wide defensive line across the Kalindra corridor. It was a textbook formation, one he had studied and practiced for decades. Morozov disagreed. He stood before the tactical display and laid out a different plan, one built not from theory, but from experience. He showed them data from battles the aliens did not know had been fought. He showed them predictive models of Vral swarm behavior, based on information gathered from the ruins of the conquered systems. He showed them attack patterns, flanking maneuvers, and kill zone formations that no alien strategist had ever conceived, because no alien species had spent its entire history fighting itself. Thys resisted. He argued. He pointed out that humans were the youngest species in the room. But one by one, the other commanders sided with Morozov, not because they liked him, but because his plan was better. It was not theoretical. It was practical. It was the plan of a species that knew what it felt like to lose a war, and had built everything around making sure it never happened again. The final intelligence report arrived on the 3rd day. The main Vral invasion fleet had been detected entering the far end of the Kalindra corridor. Over 50,000 bioships, a living wave of hunger and destruction that stretched across space like a dark cloud. Okafor stood on her bridge and watched the numbers update on her screen. 50,000 against their combined fleet of roughly 7,000. The odds were terrible. She looked at Vale, who stood at the liaison station with crystal fingers trembling against the console. "Are you afraid?" Okafor asked. "Yes," Vale admitted. "Good," Okafor said. "Fear means you understand what is happening. What matters is what you do with it." She turned to her crew. Every face was calm. Every station was ready. They had trained for this moment their entire lives, and now that it was here, there was nothing left to do but face it. "All hands," Okafor said into the shipwide channel. "Battle stations. The enemy is coming." Across the Kalindra staging point, 7,000 ships of 40 different species turned their bows toward the darkness and waited for the storm. The Vral came through the corridor like a river of black water, flooding a narrow canyon. There was no formation, no structure, no order that any allied tactician could identify. They simply poured forward, filling every available space with writhing, pulsing organic ships that ranged in size from fighter-sized parasites no bigger than a shuttle to hive carriers the size of small continents. They did not communicate on any frequency the Allies could detect. They did not slow down. They did not stop. 50,000 of them, maybe more. The sensors could not keep up with the count because the swarm kept growing, kept splitting, kept producing new organisms from within itself, like a body producing blood cells. War Marshal Thys gave the order for the Allied fleet to engage. The Solmari cruisers moved forward first, their beautiful silver hulls catching the distant starlight as they formed a wide line across the corridor. Their shields blazed to life, walls of shimmering energy that could stop almost anything. Their precision weapons fired in perfect coordination, cutting beams of concentrated light that sliced through the first wave of Vral scouts with surgical accuracy. For exactly 3 minutes, it looked like it might work. Then, the Vral adapted. The swarm shifted its approach so quickly that Allied observers could barely track it. The creatures changed their angle of attack, spreading wide and thin, coming from above and below the Solmari line simultaneously. The precision beams that had been so effective against single targets could not cover that many angles at once. Vral parasites slipped through the gaps and latched onto the cruiser hulls, eating through the metal with acid that dissolved alloy like water dissolves sugar. The Kethvari fleet surged forward to support the Solmari, their angular warships firing rapid bursts of plasma in all directions. The Draelith bioships released clouds of corrosive spores that ate through Vral flesh. The battle became a swirling, chaotic mess of light and fire and organic matter, and the Allied fleet fought bravely. But the truth became clear within the first hour. They were losing. The alien fleets fought the way they had been taught to fight. They followed their doctrines. They maintained their formations. They did everything correctly, by the book, exactly as their academies had instructed them. And it was not enough. The Vral were not an enemy that could be defeated by textbooks. They learned. They changed. They turned every predictable tactic into a trap. Fleet Admiral Morozov watched the battle unfold from the command deck of his flagship, the Terran carrier Ironwall. He had kept the human fleet in reserve, waiting for the right moment. He could see the Allied lines beginning to bend, beginning to break. He could hear the frantic communications from alien commanders who were running out of options. He opened a channel to every Terran ship. All units, this is Morozov. Execute Battle Plan Prometheus. Go. 1,200 human warships moved forward, and the battle changed. The dreadnoughts came first, arranged in what the Terran Navy called a rotating shield wall. 4 lines of heavy ships advanced in sequence, the front line absorbing fire and damage, while the lines behind it fired over its shoulder. When the front line took too much punishment, it peeled away to the rear to repair and rearm, and the next line took its place. It was a simple idea, but it required perfect timing and absolute trust between crews, and the humans executed it with mechanical precision. The Vral parasites that had overwhelmed the Solmari shields broke against the dreadnought armor like waves against a cliff. Human armor was not elegant. It was simply thick, dense, and brutally effective. The parasites chewed and clawed and burned, and the armor held, and the guns kept firing. Behind the dreadnought wall, the siege breakers activated their gravity shear weapons. These were the most terrifying tools in the human arsenal. They created artificial points of extreme gravity, tiny singularities that lasted only seconds, but warped space so violently that anything caught in their pull was crushed and torn apart. The siege breakers placed these gravity wells at key points in the corridor, creating kill zones that funneled the Vral swarm into narrow channels where the dreadnoughts could concentrate their fire. Thousands of Vral ships died in those kill zones. The creatures tried to adapt, tried to find new paths around the gravity wells, but human tacticians had anticipated this. Destroyer squadrons, operating in groups of 5 called wolf packs, raced through the gaps in the swarm at incredible speed, hunting for hive nodes, the specialized Vral organisms that coordinated the swarm's movements telepathically. Every time a wolf pack killed a hive node, the nearby swarm lost coordination for precious minutes, becoming confused and disorganized, easy targets for the dreadnought guns. The alien fleets watched in stunned silence. They had never seen anything like this. War, real war, practiced and refined and perfected by a species that had been doing it since before it could write. Every human maneuver flowed into the next. Every ship knew its role. Every crew performed as if they had done this 1,000 times before. And in their training simulations, they had. But the Vral were not finished. They had numbers that defied comprehension, and for every 1,000 that died, 10,000 more pushed forward. The battle ground on for hours, and even the human lines began to feel the pressure. Ships took damage. Crews were injured and killed. The wolf pack destroyers took heavy losses as the swarm learned to protect its hive nodes with walls of expendable drones. Captain Okafor studied the tactical display on the bridge of the unconquered sun and saw what Morozov saw. The Allied fleet was winning locally, but losing globally. They were killing Vral by the thousands, but the swarm kept coming, and at the center of it all, protected by layers upon layers of organic armor, and surrounded by a personal guard of the largest Vral organisms anyone had ever seen, was the Overmind vessel. It was the brain of the swarm, a moon-sized organism that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescent light, its surface covered in antenna-like structures that broadcast the telepathic signals controlling every Vral creature in the corridor. Kill the Overmind, and the swarm would lose its mind. The creatures would become disorganized, acting on instinct rather than strategy, easy to destroy in detail. The problem was getting to it. Okafor opened a channel to Morozov. Admiral, the unconquered sun requests permission to lead a spearhead assault on the Overmind. There was a pause. Then Morozov's voice came back, heavy and tired. You understand what you are asking, Captain. The path to the Overmind is through the densest part of the swarm. Yes, sir. Another pause. Permission granted. Take the 5th Dreadnought Squadron with you. And Rhea, come back alive. The unconquered sun turned toward the center of the Vral swarm, and 11 other dreadnoughts followed. They drove forward like a wedge being hammered into wood, their guns firing in every direction, their armor absorbing hit after hit. Vral creatures swarmed over them like insects over fruit. The hull of the unconquered sun screamed as acid ate into its outer layers. Smaller organisms forced their way through breached sections, and the fighting moved inside the ship. Vale, standing at the liaison station, watched in horror as reports came in from every deck. Vral boarding organisms, creatures the size of large dogs, with bladed limbs and acid blood, were tearing through corridors, and the humans were fighting them. Not retreating, not sealing doors and hiding, but fighting. Marines met the creatures with rifles, shotguns, and when ammunition ran out, with knives and fists and anything heavy enough to swing. Vale saw a damage report that listed a crew member who had killed a boarding creature by hitting it with a fire extinguisher until it stopped moving. These people were insane, and they were magnificent. The spearhead punched through the final layer of defenders, and the Overmind vessel filled the view screen. It was enormous, a living mountain of flesh and bone, and pulsing light. Up close, Okafor could see the telepathic antenna moving like fingers, reaching out across the void, controlling millions of creatures with thoughts that had no words. All weapons target the Overmind, Okafor ordered, and Helm, set collision course, maximum speed. Commander Torres looked at her. Captain? We are going to hit it, Okafor said, and we are going to keep shooting while we do. The unconquered sun fired everything it had. Kinetic rounds the size of cars slammed into the Overmind's surface. Nuclear lances burned craters into its flesh. Gravity shear pulses tore open wounds hundreds of meters wide. And then the ship itself struck the Overmind at full speed, 2 kilometers of metal and fury, driving into the creature's body like a spear into the side of a beast. The impact was felt across the battlefield. The Overmind shuddered. Its telepathic signal stuttered, flickered, and then went silent. Across the Kalindra corridor, 50,000 Vral creatures lost their guiding intelligence at the same instant. They stopped moving with purpose. They began to drift, to circle, to attack each other in confusion. The coordinated swarm became a mindless mob. On the shattered bridge of the unconquered sun, Captain Okafor pulled herself out of the wreckage of her command chair. Blood ran down her face. Her left arm hung at an angle that arms were not supposed to hang. Sparks fell from broken conduits above her. Half her crew was unconscious, or worse, She found the communication panel, still functioning by some miracle, and pressed the button with fingers that shook, but did not stop. "Overmind down," she said, her voice raw and broken. "All ships, finish them." The Allied fleet surged forward with everything it had left, and the slaughter began. The Battle of Calindra Corridor lasted 19 hours, from first shot to last. When it was over, the Vral invasion fleet was destroyed. Not beaten, not pushed back, destroyed. 50,000 enemy ships, reduced to drifting fields of dead organic matter that stretched across the corridor like a graveyard. The cost was terrible. Humanity lost 400 warships and over 60,000 lives. The Allied alien fleet lost nearly 3,000 vessels and hundreds of thousands of their own people. It was the bloodiest single engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. But the line had held. The galaxy was still there. And in the silence that followed the last shot, a new truth settled over every surviving being, like dust after a storm. The galaxy was quiet in the weeks that followed the Battle of Calindra Corridor. Not the comfortable quiet of peace, but the heavy quiet of a civilization sitting in the ruins of everything it thought it knew, trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. The Vral Dominion was broken. The destruction of the Overmind vessel had shattered the swarm's ability to coordinate. And without that guiding intelligence, the remaining creatures scattered into the deep black spaces between stars. They were still dangerous in small groups, still capable of attacking isolated ships or undefended outposts, but they were no longer an existential threat. They were wounded animals, running and hiding and slowly dying. The Galactic Concord established a permanent military task force to hunt the remnants. The vote on who should lead it was the shortest vote in Concord history. Every species, without exception, chose a human admiral. On Aethara, the Great Hall was repaired and reopened for a galaxy-wide memorial service. The damage from the panic of those early days had been cleaned up, the broken furniture replaced, the cracked walls mended. But the hall felt different now. The air itself seemed heavier, carrying the weight of what had been lost and what had been learned. Representatives from every species filled the curved seats. Many of them wore symbols of mourning from their own cultures. The Kethvari delegates had bands of black cloth wrapped around their upper arms. The Salmari had dimmed their crystal bodies to a soft muted gray. The Drelith had let their silver leaves fall, standing bare and stark like trees in winter. Fleet Admiral Morozov stood at the central podium. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with gray hair cut short, and lines on his face that told stories his mouth never would. He looked out at the assembled delegates, 4,000 species watching him, with eyes and sensors and organs of perception that he could not even name. And he spoke simply. "I am not good at speeches," he began. "Soldiers rarely are. So I will keep this short." He paused and looked down at his hands, which rested on the podium like two stones. "We lost good people at Calindra. Humans, Kethvari, Salmari, Drelith, and dozens of other species whose names I am still learning to pronounce. They did not die because they were brave, although they were. They did not die because they were strong, although they were that too. They died because they chose to stand between the darkness and everyone it wanted to consume. That choice is the only thing that matters." He lifted his head. "We did not come to Calindra because we wanted glory. We did not come because we wanted the galaxy to respect us. We came because someone asked for help. That is what humans do. When someone asks for help, we come. It is that simple." He stepped down from the podium without another word, and the hall was silent for a very long time. Then, starting with a single Kethvari delegate in the front row, the hall began to applaud. The sound grew and grew, until it filled the enormous space like thunder. 4,000 species expressing something that none of them had the right word for in their own languages. Something between gratitude and shame and a new, fragile respect. In a medical bay on the orbital station above Aethara, Captain Rhea Okafor lay in a bed with her left arm in a regeneration cast and bandages wrapped around her ribs. She had 3 cracked vertebrae, a fractured skull that had been repaired with surgical nanites, and enough bruises to make her body look like a painting done entirely in purple and yellow. She had been told to rest for 6 weeks. She was already planning to be back on her feet in 3. The door opened, and Vale walked in. The young Solmari moved carefully, their crystal bodies still showing the faint cracks of stress fractures sustained during the battle. They carried a small object in their hands, a crystal that glowed with soft blue light. "A healing gift," Vale said, placing it on the table beside the bed. "It is a tradition among my people. The light promotes cellular repair." "Thank you," Okafor said. She meant it. She had grown fond of the alien during their time together, this fragile being of living crystal who had stood on the bridge of a human warship during the worst battle in galactic history and had not run. Vale sat down in the chair beside the bed and was quiet for a while. Then they spoke. "I have been thinking about your species, about what I saw during the battle, about what your ship looked like from the inside while it was being torn apart, and what your people did while it was happening." Okafor said nothing. She waited. "There is a concept that has entered the Solmari language since the battle," Vale continued. "A new word. We borrowed it from your species because we did not have one of our own. The word is defiance." "You did not have a word for defiance?" Okafor asked, genuinely surprised. "No. We had words for resistance, for endurance, for patience, but defiance is something different. It is the refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat is certain. It is the choice to keep fighting, not because you believe you will win, but because you believe that fighting matters, regardless of the outcome. We never had that concept. We never needed it." Vale paused. "We need it now." The Solmari looked at Okafor with eyes that were like windows into a deep blue sea. "We thought your love of war was a flaw. The thing that made you lesser than us. I understand now that we were wrong. It was never love. It was readiness. You carry the weight of being prepared for the worst so that you never have to be helpless. That is not a flaw. That is a gift. A terrible, heavy, beautiful gift." Okafor felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her cracked ribs. She reached out with her good hand and placed it over Vale's crystal fingers. The alien's skin was cool and smooth, like touching glass that was somehow alive. "It is heavy," she agreed softly, "but it is easier to carry when you are not carrying it alone." 3 days later, Ambassador Vasquez addressed the full Concord. She stood at the same podium where Morozov had spoken, in the same hall where she had once sat in the back row, in a small seat reserved for the children of the galaxy. She did not stand in the back row this time. She stood at the center, and every eye in the room was on her. "The Vral are broken, but they are not gone," she said, "and they may not be the last threat this galaxy faces. We were unprepared. We were divided. We were lucky that the cost was not higher than it was." She looked around the hall slowly, meeting the gazes of delegates who had once looked through her as if she were not there. "I propose the creation of a Galactic Defense Initiative, a permanent joint military command, funded by all member species, trained to fight and prepared to respond to any threat. Human military doctrine will form its foundation, because our doctrine was built by a species that has been fighting for its survival since the day it first stood upright on a small blue world at the edge of nowhere." The vote passed without opposition. Not a single delegate voted against it. Several species that had sent nothing to Kalindra voted loudly in favor, their guilt doing what their courage had not. That evening, Lena stood alone at a viewport in one of Aethera's observation towers. The alien city spread out below her, glowing with its 1,000 colors, alive and intact because of what had happened at Kalindra. Above the city, moving in slow, deliberate formation against the backdrop of unfamiliar stars, a flight of human warships passed overhead. They were part of the permanent garrison now, welcomed, respected, needed. A Draelith elder joined her at the viewport. He was very old. His bark was dark and cracked, and his few remaining leaves were the color of old silver. He had been a delegate for longer than human civilization had existed, and he had spent most of that time thinking of humans as amusing little creatures who would eventually grow out of their violent tendencies. He watched the warships pass overhead and said quietly, "We called you children once." Lena smiled. It was not a smug smile, or a triumphant one. It was the smile of someone who had carried a secret for a long time, and was glad to finally set it down. "Children grow up," she said. The old Draelith nodded slowly and said nothing more. They stood together in comfortable silence, the ancient tree and the young human, watching the ships move across the sky like iron stars. Far away in the Orion Spur, in the place the galaxy had once called the Cradle, the hidden shipyards had not gone dark. The forge protocol had been downgraded from active to standby, but the factories had not stopped. New hulls took shape in the shadows of hollowed asteroids. New reactors hummed to life in the bellies of new ships. New weapons were tested in the empty spaces where no one was watching. The engineers worked quietly, as they always had. The soldiers trained, as they always had. The admirals planned, as they always had. Not because war was coming. Maybe it was, maybe it was not. That was not the point. The point was that somewhere out there, in the vast and indifferent darkness between the stars, there were things that wanted to hurt the beings that humanity had learned to call its neighbors. And as long as that was true, as long as the night held even the possibility of danger, someone had to stand guard. Humanity had always known this. It was the lesson written in every scar, every battlefield, every memorial to the fallen that dotted the surface of their homeworld. Peace was not the absence of enemies. Peace was having the strength to face them and the will to use it. The stars burned cold and distant in the void, and in the dark, quiet places where no one ever looked, humanity watched them with steady eyes and patient hands, ready for whatever came next. Because someone had to be them.